The microphone screeched before his voice cut through it, and every head in the hall turned toward the door. I was standing near the refreshment table, holding a paper cup of lemonade, laughing at something one of my students had said, when the doors of the community hall slammed open with a force that rattled the windows. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Chairs scraped as people turned to look. And there, framed by the evening light behind him, stood Damian Cross. Everyone in Ashwood knew that name. He owned half the buildings downtown, though nobody ever said out loud what else he owned. Men who worked for him did not smile easily. Women who crossed his path did not stay long in town. He was the kind of man whose presence changed the temperature of a room, and that night, the room went cold the second he stepped inside. I had heard the stories, the same way everyone in Ashwood had heard them, whispered over coffee counters, and passed between neighbors like something too dangerous to say at full volume. A warehouse fire that ended a business dispute before it could reach a courtroom. A rival who left town overnight and never came back. None of it had ever been proven, and none of it needed to be, because the fear alone was enough to keep people quiet. I did not think, for even a moment, that he was here for me. I taught literature at Ashwood High. I graded essays late into the night, kept a jar of pencils on my desk for students who forgot theirs, and spent my Saturday mornings volunteering at the town library. My name was Claire Bennett, and nothing about my life had ever touched a man like Damian Cross. So when his eyes swept across the crowded hall and landed directly on me, I actually looked over my shoulder, certain he was searching for someone else. He was not. He walked forward, his long coat catching the light, his shoes striking the wooden floor, in a rhythm that made my stomach twist. People stepped out of his way without being asked. Even Principal Hargrove, who ran this town's schools with an iron grip of his own, took a step back and said nothing. Damian stopped less than 2 feet from me, close enough that I could see the sharp line of his jaw, the coldness in his eyes, a coldness that did not belong in a room full of parents and teachers and children eating cupcakes. "Miss Bennett," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like an accusation already. "Yes," I answered, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "You know exactly why I am here." I did not. I opened my mouth to say so, but he was already speaking again, louder this time, loud enough for the entire hall to hear every word. "This woman," he said, turning slightly so the crowd could see him better, gesturing toward me like I was an exhibit, "has been feeding information to people who have no business knowing my affairs. She has been meeting with associates of a man named Victor Langley, a man who thinks he can take what belongs to me." A murmur rippled through the hall. I felt my face go hot, then cold, then hot again. My paper cup trembled in my hand, lemonade spilling over my fingers. "That is not true," I said. "I don't know anyone named Victor Langley. I have never—" "Do not lie to me in front of these people." His voice dropped, but it carried further than a shout would have. "I know what I know. I have eyes everywhere in this town, Miss Bennett, and my eyes tell me you have been careless with things that are not yours to discuss." I looked around the hall, searching for a single face that might step forward, might say something in my defense. Mrs. Whitfield, who sat beside me every week at the parent council meetings, looked down at her shoes. Coach Bellamy, who I had shared coffee with just that morning, suddenly found something fascinating on the ceiling. Even my closest friend on the staff, a science teacher named Ellen Marsh, gripped her husband's arm and stayed silent, her eyes wide with fear rather than sympathy. Nobody was going to help me, not because they believed the accusation, I realized later, but because they were all afraid of the man standing in front of me. "I have done nothing wrong," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice, even as my knees shook beneath my dress. "You have the wrong person." Something flickered across his face when I said that. It was there, and gone so fast I almost missed it. A flicker of hesitation, maybe even doubt, buried quickly beneath his hardened expression. But his voice did not soften. "I do not make mistakes," he said, "and I do not forgive them either." He turned to address the room, his voice ringing out with an authority that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Let this be understood by every man in this hall. No one is to help this woman. No one is to comfort her, to speak kindly to her, to offer her a hand or a shoulder, or a single word of comfort. If any man in Ashwood so much as walks her home tonight, he will answer to me personally. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I stood there, lemonade drying sticky on my fingers, my paper cup crushed without my noticing, staring at a man who had just destroyed my reputation, in front of half the town, in front of my students' parents, in front of people who trusted me to teach their children. And he had done it with the calm certainty of a man reading a weather report. "You cannot do this," I whispered, though I knew, even as I said it, that he could, and that he already had. "I already have," he said, echoing my own thought back at me like he had read my mind. Then he turned and walked out of the hall, his coat swinging behind him, and the doors closed with a bang that seemed to seal my fate inside that room, with everyone who now believed I was some kind of criminal. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, the hall began to empty. Parents gathered their children. Teachers avoided my eyes. The refreshment table, which had been crowded just minutes before, cleared out entirely, leaving me alone beside a bowl of half-melted ice and a stack of paper cups. I do not remember deciding to leave. I only remember finding myself outside, the autumn air sharp against my face, the parking lot nearly empty except for a few cars pulling away too quickly, their drivers refusing to look at me through the windows. Somewhere behind me, through the glass doors of the hall, I could still hear the low murmur of voices picking apart what they had just witnessed. Not one of those voices belonged to someone asking whether the accusation might be false. They were already deciding what kind of woman I must secretly be, rewriting 3 years of knowing me into something they could distrust. I understood, standing there in the cold, that a reputation could be undone in less time than it took to drink a cup of lemonade. I began to walk home. It was nearly 2 miles, and normally Coach Bellamy, or one of the other teachers, would have offered me a ride without a second thought. Tonight, his car passed me on the road, slowed for just a moment, and then sped up again, as though even that small mercy was too dangerous to offer. I understood then exactly what Damien Cross had done. He had not simply accused me of something I had not done. He had made certain that I would face the consequences of that accusation entirely alone, that no hand would reach out to steady me, that no voice would rise in my defense, that every man in this town would look at me and see only danger, only risk, only a woman not worth the trouble of kindness. My footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalk. The porch lights of houses I passed clicked off one by one, as though my neighbors had been watching for me, waiting for me to pass so they could pretend they had not seen me at all. By the time I reached my small house at the edge of town, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit my key into the lock. I stepped inside, closed the door, and pressed my back against it, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor of my own hallway, staring at nothing. I thought about the students who had been in that hall, children who trusted me, whose parents had just watched a stranger call me a criminal in front of them. I thought about the years I had spent building a life in this town, a small, quiet life, made of lesson plans and library books and Sunday dinners with the few friends I had. I thought about how quickly all of it had been taken from me, not by anything I had done, but by the word of one man who believed, wrongly, that I knew something I did not. I did not cry. I wanted to, but something inside me refused, some stubborn ember of anger that had already begun to burn beneath the fear. Because whoever Victor Langley was, whatever he had done to earn Damien Cross's fury, I had nothing to do with it. And somewhere in this town, someone had given Damien Cross my name. Someone had pointed a finger at me, knowing exactly what kind of storm they were unleashing. I sat on that floor for a long time, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, long after the shaking in my hands had stopped, and I would make Damien Cross understand exactly how wrong he had been. The clock on my wall struck 10, its chime the only sound in a house that had never felt so silent, and I finally rose from the floor, my legs unsteady beneath me, carrying myself toward a night I knew would bring no sleep at all. I walked past the small mirror hanging in my hallway and stopped for a moment, studying the woman looking back at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. Her jaw was set in a way I did not recognize from before that evening. Whoever Damien Cross believed he had humiliated into silence, I did not think she was the same woman staring back at me now. I turned off the hallway light and walked further into the dark house, already thinking of the first name I intended to ask about in the morning. Victor Langley, a man I had never met, whose existence had somehow rearranged the entire shape of my life in a single evening. My classroom door was locked from the outside when I arrived the next morning, and someone had slid a note underneath it that simply read, "Stay away for a while." I stood in the empty hallway holding that note, my school bag still on my shoulder, staring at the handwriting I recognized as Principal Hargrove's. No phone call, no conversation, just 4 words, meant to end my career, without anyone having to look me in the eye while they did it. I found him in his office 20 minutes later, sitting behind his desk with the blinds drawn, refusing to meet my gaze, even as I stood directly in front of him. "Claire," he said, using my first name for the first time in 3 years of working together, "I need you to understand my position." "Your position," I repeated. "What about my position? I have done nothing. Henry, you know me. You have known me since I started here." "I know what I saw last night," he said, and his hands trembled slightly, as he straightened a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "The whole town saw it. Parents have already called this morning asking why a teacher, accused of working with criminals, is still allowed near their children. I was never given a chance to defend myself. Nobody asked me a single question. A man walked into a community hall and made an accusation, and everyone simply believed him. That man is Damien Cross," Henry said, his voice dropping as though the walls themselves might carry the name back to its owner. "Nobody in this town survives being on his wrong side. I am sorry, Claire, truly I am, but I have a school to protect, and I cannot risk what he might do if I stand behind you." "What am I supposed to live on, Henry?" I asked, my voice rising despite my effort to keep it level. "I have rent to pay. I have a life here. You cannot simply erase 3 years of good work because one man decided to point a finger at me." Henry finally looked up, and for just a moment, I saw something almost like shame cross his features. "I will make sure your pay continues for now," he said quietly. "That much I can promise you, but I cannot promise you your classroom back until this is resolved, whatever resolved even means in a situation like this." "And who is supposed to resolve it?" "I have no idea how to prove a negative, Henry. How do I prove I never spoke to a man I have never met?" He had no answer for that, and his silence told me everything I needed to know about how alone I truly was in this fight. I left his office with nothing settled, no leave officially granted, no accusation formally withdrawn, just an unspoken understanding that I was to disappear from the building until further notice, and that further notice might never come. The walk home felt longer than it had the night before, though the distance had not changed. What had changed was the way people looked at me now, or rather, the way they refused to. Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the flower shop on Main Street and who used to wave at me every single morning, suddenly became very interested in rearranging her window display the moment she saw me approaching. The postman, a kind older man named Gerald who once helped me carry boxes of library books to my car, crossed to the other side of the street entirely, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Even Nathan Price, a young man who lived 2 houses down and who used to mow my small patch of lawn every summer, without ever asking for payment, stood frozen on his porch as I passed, his hand half raised in an automatic greeting before he caught himself and let it fall back to his side, glancing quickly toward the street, as though checking whether anyone had witnessed even that small gesture. By the time I reached my house, I understood something that frightened me more than the humiliation itself. Damien Cross had not simply damaged my reputation. He had made an example of me, a warning sign planted in the middle of this town for anyone who might consider crossing him. And warning signs, I realized, needed to remain visible for as long as possible in order to work. That evening, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea slowly going cold, I opened my laptop and began to search for anything I could find about Victor Langley. There was surprisingly little. A brief mention in an old newspaper article about a business dispute involving shipping routes along the coast. A photograph of a thin man with sharp features, standing beside a warehouse that had since been sold to new owners. Nothing that connected him to me in any way, nothing that explained why my name would ever have come up in the same conversation as his. I stayed up long past midnight, scrolling through old town records, old newspaper archives, anything that might explain the thread someone had woven between Victor Langley and myself. I found nothing, and the search left me more unsettled than before, because if there was no real connection, then someone had invented one deliberately and had chosen my name specifically to hand to Damian Cross. The following days blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable. I was technically still employed, though I no longer set foot inside the school building. My days emptied out into long stretches of silence, broken only by the occasional knock at my door that turned out to be nothing, a delivery I had forgotten ordering, a neighbor's cat scratching at the porch. On the fourth day, I ran out of groceries and forced myself to walk into town, telling myself I could not hide inside my house forever. That fear had already cost me enough, without also costing me my ability to feed myself. The grocery store was busy that afternoon, filled with familiar faces from a life that no longer felt entirely mine. I kept my eyes down, moving quickly through the aisles, gathering only what I needed. Near the register, I nearly collided with a man stepping out from behind a shelf of canned vegetables, and when I looked up to apologize, my breath caught in my throat. It was Damian Cross. He wore no coat this time, no audience gathered around him, just a plain dark jacket that made him look almost like an ordinary man, if not for the way every person near us instinctively created distance between themselves and him, the way the cashier's hands froze mid-motion over the register. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. His eyes moved over my face, and something in his expression shifted, something I could not fully name. It was not quite guilt, not yet, but it was not the cold certainty from the community hall either. It looked almost like a man reconsidering a decision he had already made public and could not easily undo. "Miss Bennett," he said finally, his voice quieter than I had heard it before. "Mr. Cross," I answered, refusing to let my voice shake this time. "You should not be out shopping alone," he said, and there was something strange in the way he said it. Not a threat exactly, but not quite concern either. "Because you have made certain no one will help me," I said. "Or have you forgotten your own order already?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might simply walk away without answering, the way he had the night he ruined my life in front of the entire town. Instead, he studied me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he were reading something written on my face that troubled him. "I do not forget anything," he said, "least of all my own orders." "Then perhaps you should reconsider whether that order was ever justified." I do not know where my courage came from in that moment, standing in a grocery store aisle in front of a man half the town feared to even glance at. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps it was the accumulated weight of every door that had closed against me over the past 4 days. Whatever it was, it made my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Something flickered in his expression again, that same hesitation from the community hall, gone almost as soon as it appeared. He said nothing for a long moment, and then he simply turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone among the canned vegetables, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I finished my shopping in a daze, barely registering what I placed into my basket, and it was only once I was outside in the parking lot, the cool afternoon air against my face, that I allowed myself to breathe properly again. That encounter stayed with me for the rest of the week, replaying itself over and over in my mind. There had been something in his eyes that did not match the certainty of his accusation, something that suggested a man who was not entirely convinced of his own conclusion, even as he refused to reverse it. I began to wonder, for the first time, whether Damian Cross himself had been lied to as thoroughly as I had been wronged. I turned the encounter over in my mind so many times that the words themselves began to lose their shape, the way a single sentence repeated too often starts to sound foreign, even in your own voice. Why would a man so certain of his own information hesitate, even for a heartbeat, when confronted by the person he claimed to be certain about? Guilt did not explain it, because I had none to feel. Something closer to doubt seemed nearer the truth, and doubt was not a quality I had expected to find anywhere near Damian Cross. I began to pay closer attention to the way people spoke about him around town, listening now not for confirmation of his cruelty, but for anything that might reveal the shape of the man underneath the reputation. An old woman at the pharmacy mentioned, without any of the fear I expected, that Damien had quietly paid for her husband's surgery 2 winters ago, and never once mentioned it to anyone. A shop owner recalled him standing guard outside her store for a full week after a break-in, refusing payment for his trouble. These were small stories, told quietly, almost as though the tellers were embarrassed to admit any kindness existed inside a man they were otherwise terrified of. They did not excuse what he had done to me in that hall, but they complicated the picture in a way that made my search for the truth feel even more urgent. If that was true, then somewhere close to him, someone had orchestrated this entire situation, someone who understood exactly how to manipulate a man, as dangerous and as feared as Damien Cross, into destroying an innocent woman's life, without ever needing to lift a finger themselves. I thought of Victor Langley again, of the thin man in the old newspaper photograph, and wondered if he was truly the architect of my ruin, or merely another piece being moved across a board by someone far more careful, someone who had chosen to remain invisible, while 2 people who had never met before that community hall were set against each other, like pieces in a game neither of us had agreed to play. That night, I began writing down everything I knew, every name, every detail, every strange look and unanswered question, filling page after page of a notebook I kept hidden inside a drawer no one else would think to search. If no one in this town was brave enough to help me, then I would simply have to help myself, and I intended to start by finding out exactly who had decided that ruining my life was worth the trouble. Ellen Marsh, the one friend who still dared to text me from a number she used only for emergencies, sent a single message that night that stopped me cold. She had heard whispers, she said, from her husband, who worked in the accounting office near the docks, that Victor Langley had once done business with a man named Peter Halloway, a name I recognized immediately as belonging to one of Damien Cross's closest and most trusted associates. I stared at that message for a long time, the pieces of a puzzle I had not even known existed beginning, slowly, to take a shape I did not yet understand, but which I was determined to uncover, no matter how long it took, or how much of this town's silence I would have to push through to find it. I wrote the name Peter Halloway at the top of a fresh page in my notebook, and drew a line connecting it to Victor Langley, and beneath that, a second line, connecting it to Damien Cross himself. 3 names, 3 men I had never spoken to in my life, and somehow, my own name had been dragged into the space between them. I did not yet know which of the 3 had chosen to place it there, but I intended to find out, even if it meant walking straight back into the kind of danger every person in this town had spent the past 4 days teaching me to fear. Before I finally allowed myself to sleep that night, I sent Ellen a single message asking her to find out anything else her husband might know about Peter Halloway, and where a man like that might be found without drawing attention to the asking. Her reply came almost immediately, short and cautious, warning me to be careful, that men who worked closely with Damien Cross were not the kind of men who forgave curiosity easily. I read her warning twice, set my phone face down on the nightstand, and closed my eyes, already planning my next move, before sleep finally, mercifully, pulled me under. Someone had been inside my house. I noticed it the moment I stepped through the front door, a subtle wrongness in the air, the smell of a cologne that was not mine, lingering faintly near the hallway. My notebook, the one containing every name and every connection I had gathered over the past week, sat exactly where I had left it on the kitchen table, but it had been turned 90 degrees from how I always positioned it, the spine facing the window instead of the wall. My hands went cold. I stood frozen in my own doorway, scanning the small living room for anything else out of place, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain it could be heard from the street. Nothing appeared to be missing. No drawer had been emptied, no window forced open that I could find. Whoever had been here had wanted only one thing, and that was to read what I had written, and to let me know, quietly and without a single word, that they had done exactly that. I checked every room twice, my footsteps careful against the floorboards, half expecting to find someone still hiding inside a closet or crouched behind the shower curtain. The house was empty, but the feeling of violation did not lessen simply because the intruder was gone. Someone had walked through my private space, touched my belongings, read my private thoughts scrawled across pages I had never intended for another set of eyes, and had done so with enough confidence to leave no other trace behind. No broken lock, no disturbed lamp, nothing but a notebook turned the wrong way as a quiet, deliberate message. I called Ellen immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what I had found, and she arrived at my door within 20 minutes, her husband trailing nervously behind her, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder, as though the street itself might be listening. "You need to stop this, Claire," she said, gripping my hands tightly once she was inside. "Whatever you are looking into, someone already knows you are looking into it, and that is not a good sign for either of us." "I cannot simply stop," I said. "I have lost my classroom. I have lost the trust of an entire town. I am not going to sit quietly and let whoever did this to me walk away untouched." Her husband, a quiet accountant named Daniel, who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, cleared his throat and finally said something that changed the direction of everything that followed. "Peter Halloway keeps an office above the old shipping warehouse on Larkspur Street," he said. "I have seen him there on nights when I stayed late finishing quarterly reports for a client whose books overlapped with some of Halloway's dealings. If you want answers, that is where you will find the closest thing to them." I spent the rest of that evening convincing myself that visiting the warehouse alone would be reckless, and I spent the following morning doing exactly that anyway. The building sat at the edge of the docks, its windows dark, except for a single lit office on the second floor, visible through a gap in aging curtains. I waited until early evening, when the workers who loaded crates during the day had gone home, and the street had emptied into a kind of hush, broken only by the distant sound of water against the pier. My plan was simple, though foolish in hindsight, to watch the building from a distance and see who came and went, hoping to learn something without ever needing to step inside. The bakery behind me had closed hours earlier, its window dark except for the faint glow of a display case left running overnight, and the smell of old flour and cooling ovens drifted out through a vent near where I stood. I kept my coat pulled tight against the evening chill, my eyes fixed on the warehouse door, counting the minutes as they passed, wondering more than once whether I had made a terrible mistake coming here without telling anyone exactly where I had gone. I had been standing across the street for perhaps 20 minutes, tucked into the shadow of a closed bakery, when a car pulled up in front of the warehouse, and a man stepped out whose face I recognized immediately from the old newspaper photograph. Victor Langley looked older in person, his features sharper, his eyes darting nervously along the street before he disappeared inside the building. My pulse quickened. I edged closer, staying low along the wall of the bakery, and managed to reach a narrow alley that ran alongside the warehouse, close enough to hear muffled voices drifting through a partially open window above me. "She has done exactly what we needed her to do," a voice said, one I did not recognize, though its confidence suggested it belonged to Peter Halloway. "Cross believes it completely. He humiliated her in front of the whole town without asking a single question. And Langley's shipment moves through the harbor without anyone watching for it," another voice answered, this one thinner, more anxious, matching the nervous energy I had seen in Victor Langley's face moments before. "As long as Cross is busy making an example of some schoolteacher, he is not paying attention to what actually matters." My stomach turned. I had been right. I was never the true target of anything, merely a convenient distraction, a name easy enough to invent a connection to, chosen because I had no power, no protection, and no way to defend myself against a man as feared as Damian Cross. "What happens when he figures it out?" Langley's voice asked, tight with worry. "He will not figure it out," Halloway answered, his confidence unwavering. "Cross trusts information that comes from inside his own organization. He will never think to question a man he has known for 15 years. By the time he realizes the schoolteacher was never connected to you at all, our shipment will already be 3 countries away, and none of this will matter anymore." I pressed myself flat against the cold brick of the alley wall, my breath coming in shallow, careful pulls, terrified that even the sound of my own breathing might carry up through that open window. I had what I needed. I had proof, or at least the beginning of proof, that Peter Halloway had manufactured my connection to Victor Langley entirely, using me as cover for a shipment that Damian Cross would otherwise have stopped without hesitation. I began retreating slowly down the alley, each step deliberate, careful to avoid the loose gravel scattered near the warehouse's back entrance. I had nearly reached the street when a hand closed around my arm from behind, firm and unexpected, and I barely stopped myself from crying out. I turned, my heart in my throat, expecting to find one of Holloway's men, and instead found myself staring directly into the eyes of Damian Cross. "What are you doing here?" he said, his voice low, urgent, in a way I had not heard from him before. "I could ask you the same question," I whispered back, my voice trembling despite every effort to keep it steady. He pulled me further into the shadows, away from the warehouse windows, his grip on my arm firm but not unkind. "Answer me, Miss Bennett. Do you have any idea what building you are standing behind?" "I know exactly what building I am standing behind," I said. "I know exactly who is inside it, and I know exactly what they are saying about you right now." His expression shifted, that same flicker of doubt I had seen twice before, except this time it did not disappear as quickly. "Explain," he said simply. So I did. In quiet, hurried words, standing in the shadow of the very building where my ruin had been engineered, I told him everything I had overheard, every word spoken by Peter Holloway and Victor Langley, every detail about a shipment moving through the harbor, while his attention remained fixed on punishing an innocent schoolteacher who had never met either man in her life. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every sentence, his eyes darkening in a way that made me understand, for the first time, exactly how dangerous a man he truly was when that danger was not aimed at me. "You are certain of what you heard," he said when I finished, his voice quiet, but edged with something sharper than doubt now. "I am certain," I said. "I would not have risked coming here if I were not certain." He studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. "You should not have come here alone," he said. "Whatever you heard, whatever proof you believe you have found, Holloway is not a careless man. If he suspected for even a moment that you were listening—" "I am aware of the risk," I interrupted. "I took it anyway, because no one else in this town was willing to help me clear my name, and I was not willing to wait for someone else to decide my fate for me." Something shifted in his eyes then, an expression I could not immediately name, though later I would recognize it as the beginning of respect, however reluctant, however unfamiliar it seemed on a face that had spent so long wearing only certainty and command. "We need to leave this area now," he said. "If Holloway realizes we were both standing outside his window, neither of us will walk away from tonight easily." He led me quickly away from the warehouse, through a series of narrow streets I had never walked before, until we reached a small car parked several blocks away, tucked out of sight beneath the shadow of an old bridge. He opened the door for me without a word, and I climbed inside, my hands still trembling from everything I had heard. We drove in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke again. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words clearly unfamiliar in his mouth, spoken carefully, as though he were testing their weight before committing to them fully. "I acted on information I trusted completely, and I never once considered that the information itself might be false. An apology does not undo 4 days of every man in this town refusing to look at me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, though I did not try to soften it. "It does not undo losing my classroom, or the trust of parents I have known for years, or the fear I felt every single night, wondering what else you might decide to take from me." "No," he agreed quietly. "It does not, but it is where I intend to start." I turned to look at him then, studying the man who had destroyed my reputation in a single evening, who now sat beside me in the dark, driving away from a warehouse that held proof of his own betrayal by men he had trusted for years. He did not look like the cold, commanding figure who had stormed into that community hall. He looked, in that moment, almost uncertain, a man confronting the possibility that his own judgment had failed him completely. "What do you intend to do about Peter Holloway?" I asked. "I intend to find out everything," he said, his voice hardening again, the coldness returning to his eyes, though this time it was not directed at me. "And when I have proof of my own, I intend to make certain he understands exactly what it costs a man to betray my trust." I watched the streetlights slide past the window as we drove, each one briefly illuminating his face before shadow claimed it again, and I found myself studying him in those small flashes of light, searching for some clue as to which version of this man I had actually been speaking with tonight. His hand stayed steady on the wheel, though his jaw remained tight, and every so often his eyes flicked toward the mirrors, as though he expected Holloway's men to appear behind us at any moment. "Why did you come to that warehouse tonight?" I finally asked, breaking the long silence. "You said your information came from someone you trusted completely. What made you doubt it enough to go looking yourself?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "A man in my position survives by trusting his instincts as much as his sources," he said. "And my instincts have been troubling me since the moment I said your name in that hall. I told myself it was nothing. I have made difficult decisions before, and I have always been able to live with them. This one, I found, I could not simply set aside." I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, and we drove the rest of the way to my house without speaking, the silence between us heavy with everything that had shifted in the span of a single evening. When he finally stopped the car outside my small house at the edge of town, he turned to face me one final time. "You will hear from me again soon, Miss Bennett," he said, "and when this is finished, I intend to correct, publicly and completely, everything I said about you in that hall." I stepped out of the car without answering him, watching as his taillights disappeared down the quiet street, and stood alone on my porch for a long time afterward, trying to reconcile the man who had just apologized to me with the man who had humiliated me in front of the entire town. Both of them, I realized, were real. Both of them existed inside the same person, and I had no way yet of knowing which one would ultimately decide how this story ended. Inside my house, I sat back down at my kitchen table, opened my notebook to a fresh page, and began writing everything down, while the details remained sharp in my memory, aware that whatever came next would depend entirely on how quickly Damian Cross could gather proof against the men who had used both of us as pieces in a much larger game, and how far he was willing to go once he found it. I did not sleep well that night, my mind circling back again and again to the sound of Peter Holloway's voice through that warehouse window, the casual confidence with which he had described using me, a woman he had never even met, as nothing more than a convenient shield for a shipment worth more to him than my entire life and reputation combined. I thought of the parents who had pulled their children away from me in that hall, of Henry Hargrove's trembling hands as he told me to stay away from my own classroom, of every closed door and averted gaze I had endured over the past week, all of it built on a lie invented by a man sitting comfortably above a shipping warehouse, while other people paid the price for his ambition. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I finally understood the shape of the anger that had been building inside me since the moment Damian Cross first spoke my name in that crowded hall. It was not only anger at him, though he had earned a share of it fairly. It was anger at a world that allowed men like Peter Holloway to reach into an ordinary woman's life and rearrange it entirely for their own convenience, certain that no one would ever question it, certain that fear alone would keep every witness silent. I intended to prove that certainty wrong, whatever it cost me to do it. 3 days passed without a single word from Damian Cross, and on the fourth morning, someone fired a bullet through the front window of my house while I was still asleep in the next room. The sound of shattering glass tore me out of sleep so violently that I hit the floor before I even understood what had happened, my heart slamming against my ribs, my ears ringing with a sharp pain that took several seconds to fade. I crawled toward the hallway, staying low the way I had once seen actors do in films, terrified in a way I had never experienced before, not even in that community hall, not even outside that warehouse. By the time the police arrived, I had found the note wrapped around the small stone that had accompanied the bullet through my window, a warning scrawled in hurried handwriting, telling me to stop asking questions I had no business asking, or the next visit would not end with a broken window. The officer who took my statement was a heavy-set man named Gordon Pratt, who wrote everything down slowly, glancing up at me every few sentences, with an expression that told me he already suspected this case would go nowhere. When I mentioned the names Peter Holloway and Victor Langley, his pen paused entirely, and he set it down on the small notepad balanced on his knee. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "I am going to write down what you have told me, but I want to be honest with you. Cases involving men connected to Damian Cross's circle rarely reach a courtroom in this town. The evidence tends to disappear, or the witnesses change their story, or the whole matter simply stops being investigated one morning without anyone explaining why. So you are telling me no one will help me, I said. I am telling you that the kind of help you need may not come from people wearing a badge, he said quietly, gathering his notepad and standing to leave. Be careful, Miss Bennett. Lock your doors, and consider staying somewhere else for a few nights if you have anywhere to go. I did not have anywhere to go, and staying seemed no more dangerous than fleeing to a place where no one would be watching my street at all. I called Damian Cross's number, the one he had given me before driving away 3 nights earlier, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone twice before he answered. They know, I said, before he could speak. Someone shot through my window this morning. They left a warning. There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a coldness sharper than anything I had heard from him before, though this time I understood it was not aimed at me. I am coming to you now, he said. Do not leave your house. Do not answer the door for anyone but me. He arrived within 15 minutes, faster than should have been possible from wherever he had been, and when he stepped through my door and saw the shattered glass still scattered across my living room floor, something in his expression hardened into an intensity that made even me take an instinctive step backward. This ends today, he said. I have spent the last 3 days gathering proof of everything you overheard. Bank transfers routed through accounts Holloway believed I did not know existed. Shipping manifests altered to hide cargo he never declared to me. I know everything now, Miss Bennett, and I know exactly how he used your name to buy himself time. Then why has nothing changed? I said, gesturing at the broken window behind me. If you already have proof, why am I still the one paying for it? Because proof alone does not undo 4 days of public humiliation, he said, his voice quieter now. I intend to correct that properly, in front of the same people who witnessed what I did to you. Not quietly, not behind closed doors where it changes nothing for you. But first, I need you safe, and I need Holloway to believe he still has the advantage until the moment I take it from him completely. He arranged for 2 of his own men to remain outside my house that night, men whose names I never learned, quiet and watchful, standing at a respectful distance that somehow still made me feel safer than I had in over a week. Damian himself stayed only long enough to inspect the broken window and speak briefly on the phone with someone I could not identify, his voice low and clipped, giving instructions I did not fully understand, but which I trusted, for the first time, were meant to protect rather than harm me. While one of his men swept broken glass into a dustpan and the other examined the angle the bullet must have traveled from the street, Damian crouched beside me at the kitchen table, his eyes searching my face carefully. You are shaking, he said, and it was not a question. I was asleep when it happened, I said. I have never heard a gunshot that close before. I do not think I understood, until this morning, how far someone was willing to go to keep me quiet. They will not go further, he said, and there was a certainty in his voice that I found, strangely, more comforting than frightening. I promise you that. You made promises before, I reminded him, unable to keep a trace of bitterness from my voice. You promised the entire town that I had betrayed your trust. Forgive me if your promises no longer carry the weight they once might have. He absorbed that without flinching, though something in his eyes tightened, a flash of the same guilt I had glimpsed in the grocery store aisle days earlier. That is fair, he said quietly. I will not ask you to trust my word again until I have earned it back through actions rather than promises. Before he left that evening, he paused at my door and turned back to face me. I made a mistake in that hall, he said, and I have spent every day since trying to understand how a man who prides himself on trusting no one blindly allowed himself to be manipulated so completely. The answer, I think, is that I trusted the wrong kind of loyalty. Holloway had worked for me for 15 years. I never once considered that 15 years of service might simply be 15 years of patience, waiting for an opportunity like this one. And what happens now? I asked. Now, he said, we make certain he never gets another opportunity. The following morning, before anything else could happen, Holloway made his move. A car I did not recognize idled outside my house shortly after dawn, and when I looked through the curtains, I saw Peter Holloway himself, standing on my front path, no longer hiding behind falsified paperwork or whispered instructions through a warehouse window, his face tight, with the particular desperation of a man who understood his careful scheme, was unraveling faster than he could contain it. I did not open the door. Instead, I called the number Damien had given me, my voice low and urgent as I described exactly who stood outside my house. "Do not go near him," Damien said, his voice sharp with an alarm I had not heard from him before. "Stay inside, lock every door. I am on my way, and so are the men watching your street." Through the gap in the curtain, I watched Holloway pace the front path, glancing repeatedly toward the road, as though calculating how much time remained before someone arrived to stop him. He knocked once, twice, his voice calling out my name, with a false gentleness that made my skin crawl, promising he only wanted to talk, that there had been a terrible misunderstanding he wished to clear up between us directly. "Miss Bennet," he called again, his knuckles rapping against the wood a third time. "I only need a moment. Whatever you believe you heard, I assure you the truth is far more complicated than it seemed. We can help each other, if you will only open the door and let me explain." I did not believe a single word. His voice carried the same practiced confidence I had heard through the warehouse window, the tone of a man accustomed to talking his way around difficult truths, and I understood that opening that door would accomplish nothing except placing myself directly within his reach. Within minutes, 2 cars arrived nearly simultaneously, one carrying the men who had been watching my house through the night, the other carrying Damien himself, his expression carved from stone as he stepped out and crossed the distance toward Holloway in long, unhurried strides that somehow felt more threatening than if he had run. I watched from the window as words passed between them, too quiet for me to hear through the glass, though I could read enough in the set of Holloway's shoulders, the way he raised his hands slightly as though pleading, to understand that whatever confidence had carried him to my doorstep that morning had already abandoned him completely. Damien's men closed in from either side, and within moments, Holloway was being led away toward one of the waiting cars, his protests growing quieter with every step. Damien remained on my path a moment longer, and when he finally turned toward my door, I unlocked it and let him inside. "He came here believing he could still salvage something," Damien said. "Perhaps convince you to recant whatever you claim to have overheard. Perhaps threaten you into silence before I could gather enough proof to move against him publicly. He underestimated how quickly I would act once I understood what he had done." "And now?" I asked, my hands still trembling slightly from the sight of Holloway standing on my own front path. "Now I have everything I need," Damien said. "Every falsified record, every witness among my own men willing to testify to what they saw, and now an attempted approach to a woman he knew held evidence against him. There is nothing left for him to hide behind." He studied me for a long moment, something gentler than I had ever seen from him softening the hard lines of his face. "You have been remarkably brave through all of this, Miss Bennet. Braver, I think, than I deserve after what I did to you in that hall." "I did not have the luxury of being anything else," I said. "Fear does not pay rent, and it does not clear a woman's name either." He nodded slowly, as though turning that thought over carefully in his mind, and then he told me what he intended to do next, that within 2 days, he would gather the same town that had witnessed my humiliation, and in that same room, he would make certain every one of them understood exactly how wrong they had been to believe it. "I want you standing beside me when I say it," he said. "Not hidden away, not spoken about as though you are not present. I want every person in that hall to see you as I finally see you, and to understand that the woman they turned away from deserved better than every one of them gave her, myself included." I did not answer immediately. Part of me wanted nothing more than to disappear from Ashwood entirely, to leave behind a town that had abandoned me so easily the moment fear demanded it. But a stronger part of me, the part that had spent the last week refusing to be silenced, understood that walking back into that hall on my own terms, standing beside the very man who had humiliated me, and watching him admit it publicly, would mean something that simply vanishing never could. "I will be there," I said finally. "But you will not soften a single word for my comfort. I want the truth told exactly as it happened, all of it, including your part in it." "Agreed," he said, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I believed him completely. The same doors that had slammed open weeks earlier now stood propped wide, and I walked through them on my own 2 feet, instead of fleeing through them in tears. The community hall filled quickly that evening, word having spread through Ashwood that Damien Cross intended to make a second announcement, and the air carried a nervous energy entirely different from the fear that had gripped the room the last time everyone gathered here. People whispered among themselves, casting curious glances toward the door, none of them quite certain what to expect, though I noticed several eyes widen with surprise the moment they saw me walk in beside him, rather than standing alone as his target. I had spent the entire afternoon deciding what to wear, an oddly ordinary concern given everything that had brought me back to this hall, and had finally settled on the same simple blue dress I had worn the night this began, a small private choice that felt, to me at least, like reclaiming something rather than surrendering to memory. Standing in the doorway once more, I felt the same eyes that had once watched me humiliated, now watching me walk in composed, upright, and very much unwilling to shrink from a single one of them. Ellen found me near the entrance and squeezed my hand tightly before taking her seat, her husband Daniel offering a small, encouraging nod beside her. Henry Hargrove sat near the front, his hands folded tensely in his lap, unable to quite meet my eyes yet, though he had called me the previous afternoon to say my classroom would be waiting whenever I felt ready to return. Damien walked to the center of the hall, and the crowd fell silent almost instantly, the same way it had weeks before, though this time, the silence carried anticipation rather than dread. Several weeks ago, in this very room, he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall, I stood in this same place and accused a woman of betraying my trust. I told all of you that Claire Bennett had been feeding information to men, working against my interests. I forbade any of you from offering her comfort, from walking her home, from speaking a single kind word in her defense. I was wrong, and every consequence that followed from that lie falls entirely on me. A ripple of astonishment moved through the crowd. I watched faces I recognized, faces that had turned away from me on the street just days earlier, now turning toward Damien with expressions of confusion and disbelief, some leaning forward as though afraid to miss a single word. The information I acted on that night was manufactured, he continued, by a man I trusted for 15 years. Peter Halloway invented a connection between Miss Bennett and a business rival named Victor Langley, specifically because she had no power to defend herself against an accusation from a man like me. While I spent days making certain no one in this town would help her, Halloway moved stolen cargo through the harbor entirely unwatched, using my own fury as cover for his theft. Somewhere near the back of the hall, I saw Peter Halloway's brother, a quiet man named Oliver, who ran a small hardware store on the edge of town, lower his eyes to the floor, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a family name that would carry this shame for years to come. He had nothing to do with what his brother had done, and yet I found myself feeling a small measure of sympathy for a man about to inherit a burden he never asked for, a reminder that the damage caused by greed rarely stays contained to the person who caused it. He paused, letting the weight of that settle over the room, before continuing. I have proof of every falsified transaction, every altered shipping record, every lie he constructed to protect his ambitions, at the cost of an innocent woman's reputation and livelihood. Halloway has already been dealt with in ways this town does not need to witness directly, but which I assure you will be thorough. Victor Langley fled the region the moment he understood the scheme had collapsed, though distance will not save him from the consequences that follow him regardless. He turned then, and unexpectedly, he turned to face me directly in front of the entire hall. Claire Bennett is one of the finest teachers this town has ever had, he said, his voice softening in a way I had never heard from him before, not even in our quiet conversations over the past week. She showed more courage confronting the truth of what happened to her than most men in this room showed by simply choosing silence when she needed them most. I owe her an apology far greater than words can properly deliver, but I intend to spend as long as it takes making certain her name is fully restored in this town, and that every single person here understands exactly the debt I owe her. The hall remained silent for a long moment, nobody quite certain how to respond to a man like Damien Cross, admitting fault so openly, so completely, in front of the very people who feared him most. Then, slowly, people began to move. Ellen reached me first, tears in her eyes as she wrapped her arms around me tightly, whispering an apology of her own for every text message she had been too afraid to send during the worst days of that week. Henry Hargrove approached next, his apology stumbling and awkward, admitting that fear had made a coward of him when his teacher needed a principal willing to stand beside her instead. One by one, others followed, faces I recognized from the school, from the grocery store, from the quiet streets that had emptied whenever I walked past during those long, isolating days. Mrs. Abernathy from the flower shop apologized for hiding behind her window display. Gerald the postman admitted he had crossed the street out of fear rather than judgment, and that the shame of it had followed him every day since. Even Coach Bellamy, who had driven past me on that first cold night without stopping, found me near the refreshment table and offered a quiet, genuine apology that I chose, after a moment's consideration, to accept. I did not forgive all of them easily, and I told several of them so directly, unwilling to pretend that fear excused the cruelty of their silence during the worst week of my life. Forgiveness, I had come to understand over the past weeks, was not something owed automatically, simply because someone finally worked up the courage to ask for it. But I accepted their apologies as a beginning, understanding that rebuilding trust would take considerably longer than the single evening it had taken to destroy it, and that patience, however difficult, was the only honest path back to the life I had built here. Nathan Price, the young man from 2 houses down who had frozen mid-wave on his porch weeks earlier, approached last, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I should have said something that night," he admitted. "I have thought about it every day since. I am sorry I did not." "Thank you for saying so now," I told him, and meant it, though I made certain my voice carried none of the easy forgiveness he perhaps hoped for. Growth, I had decided, deserved acknowledgement, even when it arrived later than it should have. Later that night, once the hall had emptied and only Damien and I remained standing near the doors where this entire ordeal had begun, he turned to me one final time, his usual composure softened into something more uncertain than I had ever seen from him. "What happens now, between us?" I asked, unsure exactly what I wanted the answer to be. "That depends entirely on you," he said. "I have wronged you in ways I can spend the rest of my life trying to correct. And I do not expect forgiveness, simply because I finally told the truth in front of this town tonight. But I would like the chance to earn something closer to your trust, if you are willing to allow it, however long that takes." I studied him for a long moment. This man who had destroyed my reputation with a single accusation, and then spent every day since trying to dismantle the very scheme that had deceived him. A man capable of both devastating cruelty and genuine, difficult honesty, both existing inside the same person without contradiction. "You can start," I said, "by understanding that trust, once broken this completely, does not rebuild itself through one evening of public honesty, however sincere it was. It will take time. It will take more evenings like this one, more proof that the man standing here now is the one I can rely on, rather than the one who spoke my name like an accusation in front of an entire town." "I understand," he said. "I am prepared for however long that takes." "We will see," I said finally, and though it was not the answer he might have hoped for, something in his expression suggested he understood it was, for now, exactly the answer he deserved. In the weeks that followed, my classroom reopened, and I stood in front of my students again, teaching lessons that felt somehow more meaningful after everything I had endured to return to that room. My students had heard fragments of the story from their parents, and though none of them asked me directly what had happened, I noticed a new gentleness in the way they handed in their assignments, a quiet solidarity that touched me more than any formal apology could have. One student, a shy girl named Charlotte who rarely spoke in class, left a small folded note on my desk one morning that simply read, "I am glad you came back, Miss Bennett," and I kept that note tucked inside my desk drawer for the rest of the year. Parents who had once pulled their children away from me now greeted me warmly in the hallways, though I noticed some of them still could not quite meet my eyes, carrying their own private shame at how quickly they had turned away when fear demanded it. Damien kept his distance at first, respecting the boundary I had drawn, though small gestures found their way to me regardless. A note left with the school secretary confirming that Holloway's associates had been fully removed from any position where they might threaten me again. A quiet word passed along that Victor Langley had finally been located and would trouble no one further. He did not push for more than I was willing to give, and that patience, more than any grand gesture he might have attempted, began slowly to change the shape of what I believed about him. Once, In early winter, I encountered him again by chance outside the very grocery store where we had first spoken honestly with one another, and this time, neither of us hurried away from the conversation. We spoke for nearly 20 minutes, standing on the sidewalk in the cold, discussing nothing of great importance. The ordinary small talk of two people, slowly, carefully, learning how to exist near one another without the shadow of that terrible night hanging over every word. It was, I realized afterward, the first conversation between us that had nothing to do with accusations, warehouses, or stolen cargo, and something about its ordinariness felt like its own quiet kind of progress. Ellen asked me one afternoon, over coffee at her kitchen table, whether I thought I could ever truly trust a man capable of what Damien had done to me in that hall. I considered the question carefully before answering. I think, I said, that everyone in this town showed me exactly who they were during those difficult days, for better or worse. Damien showed me his worst moment first, publicly, catastrophically, and then spent every day afterward proving he was capable of something better. That is not nothing. It is not everything either, not yet. But it is more than most people in this town managed to offer me when I needed it most. Ellen studied me for a long moment before smiling gently. That sounds like the beginning of forgiveness to me, she said. Perhaps it was. I did not have a clear answer even for myself, standing at the edge of a story that had begun with humiliation and fear, and was slowly, carefully, becoming something else entirely, something I had not expected, and was not yet ready to name. What I knew for certain was this. I had walked into that community hall as a woman the entire town believed guilty of a crime she never committed, and I had walked out of it, weeks later, standing on my own terms, having found the truth myself when no one else was willing to look for it, having faced down danger that would have frightened away someone less determined to reclaim her own name. Whatever came next between Damien Cross and myself, I intended to face it the same way I had faced everything since that first terrible night, with my eyes open, my judgment my own, and no man's warning powerful enough to keep me from choosing my own path forward. Sometimes, walking home in the evening along the same streets that had once emptied at the sight of me, I thought about how easily an entire town had believed a single accusation, how quickly kindness could disappear the moment fear demanded silence instead. I did not think that lesson would ever fully leave me, nor did I think it should. It had taught me something about the fragility of belonging in a small place, and something equally important about my own capacity to endure when belonging was stripped away entirely. I still taught my students the same lessons I always had, still kept my jar of spare pencils on my desk, still spent my Saturday mornings at the library among the same worn shelves I had always loved. But I carried myself differently now, aware of exactly how much I was capable of surviving, and unwilling ever again to let silence, mine or anyone else's, decide the shape of my own story.